She's been online. You can't always see everyone, but I want to thank her for her participation. And I'm going to turn over to Senator Lee to ask a few more questions. We have a vote coming up, so he and I will close with some questions. Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair. As I've said several times, the social media giants, Facebook and Twitter, appear increasingly to be flagrantly biased against conservatives and apparently have no reservations about kicking them off their platforms or otherwise taking adverse action against them or things that they post. And I say this as someone who's been a pretty loyal, faithful customer, consumer of their services over the last 12 years or so. This didn't exist at all when I first started using social media platforms a dozen years ago. It was an effective, albeit new technology that just allowed people to share information as they saw fit. It didn't exist for quite some time. At first it was subtle, and I hoped that I was just misunderstanding what was happening. But it's continued to grow to the point that, like I say, it's unmistakable. I find it interesting that the censorship, the political bias became more brazen as the companies grew, but perhaps more importantly, as their market dominance became more complete. So when a platform feels like it can treat its own users, its own customers that way, that raises some questions. Mr. Ribnichek, when a platform acts like this, taking a very large segment of its user population and treats them that way, doesn't that tend to indicate that the platform doesn't think that it faces any serious competitive threat?
So I'd say that I'm certainly sympathetic to these issues of bias, and I think it is, to the extent it is because of a competition issue, the antitrust laws would be capable of tackling that, right? So if this is being, if these issues are being raised because of anti-competitive practices, then there's nothing under the antitrust laws that would prevent the agencies or other plaintiffs from prosecuting them and finding and kind of outlining and articulating how that is a competition problem. I suspect that these are broader societal issues and policy questions that I'm certainly not an expert in, that are probably better to address this type of issue. But to the extent it's a competition problem, I have not heard an explanation for why the antitrust laws can't get to it, because if we articulate it in an antitrust concern.
Right. Because typically if you did have an industry in which there were alternatives, in which there was actual competition, if one just started discriminating either on the basis of political ideology, economic views, or anything else that tends to divide large groups of people, you might have large migrations of people from one platform to another. Ms. Baker, let's go to you next. When conservatives are deplatformed, we're often told, look, if you don't like it, you can go out and build your own. Mm-hmm. For a long time, I found that argument persuasive. I really don't like government intervention in anything. I'm actually more open to it in the field of antitrust than I am many others, but across the board, I'd rather have government stay out for the most part. The argument works in some areas, in some ways, but the if you don't like it, go build your own argument lost a lot of steam recently. Parler tried. And what happened? Well, Apple and Google and Amazon all teamed up to just kick Parler off the internet and out of the zone of being able to operate entirely. Build your own sounds really nice in theory, but in this instance, I'm not sure it works in practice. Do we have an entry problem?
So I'd like to separate this a bit from the specific Parler incident, because I think that ended up being more of a contract dispute overall, and I talk about this in my written comments. market entry is a bit different now, and not that it's harder to enter, it's that new market entrants tend to not replicate the same platform and the same product, but kind of, as I kind of described it here, they enter from the side. They have a new product that devalues the core asset of whatever they're competing with. So it's, no one's really building a new Facebook because it's already been done. I mean, maybe people are trying to do that, but that's just not where the startup community and the venture capital community is going.
It did in the case of Parler. I mean, they did, in fact, build a new social media network, and they had an app, and all within a matter of days. You had Amazon refusing to continue to provide cloud services, thus taking them out of operation altogether. And you had both Apple and Google within, I don't know, hours of each other, removing them from their app store. So you're right, there doesn't seem to be a lot of entry into the marketplace. In this instance, there was a new entrant. And granted, Parler was a much, much smaller platform, had far fewer users than Twitter, and certainly far fewer than Facebook and Instagram. Nonetheless, once they got into this, they got kicked out. It's difficult to see that as a robust marketplace where new entrants can make a play, doesn't it?
Well, to address your first problem, I mean, it's not exactly the same product either. It is, geared toward a separate set of consumers. But from my understanding of the Parler case, and it's pending litigation. I don't like to weigh in on things without knowing, what's in all of the documents and that sort of thing. But it sounds like they dropped their antitrust claim, and that was more of some sort of contract dispute. How you would resolve that problem, I think it would be really dangerous to tell companies that they have to provide a service. So I understand that it's a problem, but I see a huge risk of overcorrecting there.
Mr. Rybniczek, we hear a lot of talk about increasing concentration within industries. And that's not exactly the same thing as concentration in product markets. Is it? Can you explain the difference?
Sure. So the initial studies that started this big debate were at the sector level. So combining used cars and boats, or fishing reels and groceries, products that I don't think anybody would consider substitutes. And that is where the essence of competition comes, between alternatives and substitutes. The more recent research, including research that just came out this year, shows that the concentration at the product level in local markets is decreasing. And that is much more informative, if concentration is to be taken as informative, than thinking about sector level competition. Dr. Rose mentioned, and this is how often the debate goes, which is we start off by talking about aggregate data and national level data, and then people pick and choose more narrow markets to support a whole overhaul of the antitrust laws. Dr. Rose identified a few that we commonly hear, which is airlines and healthcare and others. And I would just point out that those are typically the ones that are the most heavily regulated by the government, are the ones where proponents of reform point to as concentrated.
Those born in captivity rather than born in freedom. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, very good. Thank you, Senator Lee.